If you've lived in Israel for any amount of time, or if you're a Christian who's lived in Europe or the West, and really if you're an informed citizen of the world, then you know the word pogrom. Maybe you're like me and for years you had a vague sense that it's a word that denotes destructive mob violence perpetrated against a minority ethnic group, most often Jews, most often in Europe and Russia. But being that it happened so long ago, it can seem to pale in comparison to the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust and the world wars. So often their details and significance are lost. Of course, if you've lived here, then you might have heard or read, as a Christian, because if you're Jewish, then you certainly know this, that the pogroms played a pivotal role in precipitating the first waves of Jewish immigration from Russia to the land of Israel in the late 1800s. And if you're American, then you might be aware that those pogroms were a major cause in driving hundreds of thousands of Jews to immigrate to the United States. In fact, in the relatively short period between 1880 and the start of World War I in 1914, some 2 million Jews immigrated to America, raising the proportion of Jews among European immigrants from less than 5% to nearly 50%. But what actually happened in those ghastly pogroms, and what exactly caused them? Now, we live at a comfortable enough distance from those atrocities to not have any complicated feelings about what could have possibly motivated people to commit such heinous crimes. And thankfully, the vast majority of Western Christians, of the Western Christian world, has thankfully achieved a level of maturity and capacity for self-criticism that it no longer feels the need to justify such grotesque anti-Jewish sentiment. Of course, this was not the case for 1900 years, but it is definitely a sign of immense progress and healing that most of us look aghast at people expressing anti-Semitic views and as a fringe few in desperate need of correction. This is obviously a good thing. We've relegated anti-Semitism to a category of illegitimate beliefs and ideologies that is unworthy of serious consideration. We've canceled them, to use an unpopular term, and rightfully so. But that kind of black and white clarity can sometimes counterintuitively hinder us from understanding how people come to think what they think and believe what they believe. And it is a product of this cancel culture that we live in, and we are all guilty of, that even just suggesting we should try to understand the unthinkable automatically means we are defending the indefensible and giving legitimacy to the irredeemable. So, for example, it's easy just to dismiss those masses of common European and Russian citizens as being infected with this thing called anti-Semitism, as if it were some disease foreign to a normally healthy functioning body and mind. Or we might even see this strange, inscrutable disease of an ideology as having infected an entire culture or religion from the outside. And we struggle to see how something so diabolical could take form organically within us, within our own thought processes and our own belief system, our own experiences. I say our own because we can't and won't understand it unless we see it as our own. Indeed, historically, as heirs to Christendom, it is our own. And as the famous adage goes, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Of course, that history is complex, and it's absolutely crucial to avoid simplistic explanations to a centuries-old problem like anti-Semitism. There are deep-seated theological reasons that an antipathy for Jews has remained so intractable within Christianity for so long. Those theological justifications were certainly present and active during the pogroms. Indeed, the church was a prime purveyor of anti-Jewish hatred at the time. But that has been the case for centuries. So what instigated this extraordinary violent wave of attacks in which tens of thousands of Jews were killed across hundreds of towns over the course of several years? Well, one factor that stands out is the fact that in Russia in particular, the monarch and his very ruling system were believed to be in a state of crisis. There had been growing protests, especially among the intelligentsia, calling for reform. Some even advocated abolishing the monarchy entirely and establishing a more popular representative government. The Tsar felt threatened by these calls, and disagreements evolved into violent clashes at times. The Russian people themselves increasingly became divided over issues and came to see their ideological opponents as dangerous adversaries. What could have so corrupted their thinking that they could support such a deranged position? Each side said of the other. Why, the Jews, of course, always the Jews. But how? Why always blame the Jews? Now, we've all read accounts of the protocols of Zion and the infinite other ways elaborate theories have been constructed to supposedly establish how the influence of Jews corrupted governments, ideas, culture. The list is unending. And we immediately recognize them all as conspiracy theories, especially because they involve Jews. Today, from our current vantage point, it's a dead giveaway. It's our canary in the coal mine. When a people or a society start blaming Jews for their ills, we have a clear indication that they have lost the ability to honestly and self-critically assess themselves, and they are on a path to destruction. It seems preposterous, just completely ridiculous, that anyone would entertain ideas like these. It makes us angry because it's so obviously illogical. But that's how conspiracy theories work. They're impervious to logic. Those Russians didn't have the notion that anti-Semitism is clearly evil, so it wasn't a tripwire to stop them on that path to believing that the conspiracy that Jews were to blame for the violence in the revolution. Nor was the notion that conspiracy theories themselves could be a tripwire to dangerous ideas. Indeed, the Tsar blamed others like the Freemasons too. Anything and anyone is a potential target in a conspiracy theory. This is Isaiah speaking in chapter 8, 11 and 12. This is what the Lord says to me with his strong hand upon me, warning me not to follow the way of this people. Do not call conspiracy everything this people calls a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear. Do not dread it. Now, granted, Isaiah doesn't say don't call anything a conspiracy, but rather don't call everything people call a conspiracy. Because there's a complicating factor here. There is such a thing as a real conspiracy. In fact, Isaiah was in the middle of a conspiracy as he wrote these words. Actually, the entire nation was caught between two conspiracies, and the people were struggling over which conspiracy was the right one, which one was sanctioned by God, and which one wasn't. So how are we supposed to know? And what exactly did Isaiah mean by conspiracy anyway? Well, in the Hebrew Bible, the word for conspiracy, kesher, denotes an agreement between parties to work together in order to commit a crime or a treachery. For example, a few years after Isaiah likely spoke these words in Judah, a genuine conspiracy took place in the northern kingdom of Israel. 2 Kings 15:30 describes how Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah, son of Remaliah. He attacked him and assassinated him, and then succeeded him as king. So when it says he conspired against him, that's similar to how we think of the concept. An often negative act devised in secret that only a few are aware of, and that has the power to affect a major political or social change, like the secretly planned assassination of a king, for example. That's a legitimate conspiracy of the kind that continues to happen to this day. But that isn't the conspiracy that Isaiah is referring to in this chapter 8. He's talking about two much larger conspiracies, both of them terrible, both of them soon to have devastating consequences on the entire nation of Israel. both of them unstoppable. Isaiah was referring first to a major coalition that was forming all around the kingdom of Judah's border. That same Pekach, who was later killed in a conspiracy himself, had decided to contrive a conspiracy on a grand scale. He had grown tired of being a vassal state to the oppressive Assyrian Empire and paying exorbitant tributes just for the right to exist. He would rather rebel. But the Israelites could never break free by themselves and expect to survive. There was only hope if a coalition of neighboring nations joined and revolted together. Principally, the more powerful Arameans were leading the charge, but they also convinced the Philistines and Edomites and others to join. But there was one major obstacle to their scheme. They needed the king of Judah, where Isaiah was serving, to join them as well. And Judah was not having any of it. Now, this isn't a simple story of righteous men overcoming evil men. Describing Pekach, the king of Israel, the Bible states its traditional assessment of kings that are generally deemed failures. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. Pekach had himself come to power by murdering the previous king Pekahiah in a coup d'etat. And yet the ruler of Judah was in some ways even worse. It says of King Ahaz that he too did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He followed in the ways of Israel and even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations of the Lord, that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. But the prophet Isaiah served in King Ahaz's court, and he somehow needed to convince him to do the right thing. The king was terrified. It says, the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. But Isaiah delivers a word from the Lord saying, be careful, be calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because these two smoldering stubs of firewood, referring to Pekach and King Rezin of Aram, Isaiah tells Ahaz he will not succumb to this coalition because they will eventually end up as two smoldering stubs of firewood. But that's not what it felt like for several long years. Pekach and his alliance determined that if Judah will not join their alliance, then Judah must be destroyed and its assets distributed among them. And that's exactly what they set out to do. Tearing huge swaths of territory away from Judah from every direction, in the Negev and in Transjordan. It must have been terrifying. Despite that terror, Isaiah warns Ahaz not to be tempted into an alliance with the giant empire of Syria either. Isaiah had the insight to know that the Assyrians would swallow everyone and everything in its path, including the northern kingdom of Israel and its allies. But what was to stop the Assyrians from conquering Judah as well, Ahaz might have thought. Maybe if Assyria was preempted with a promise of loyalty, Judah might be spared. And maybe Assyria can be persuaded with enough money to come to Judah's rescue. It was an agonizing dilemma. And Ahaz certainly wasn't going to follow Isaiah's advice that he shouldn't join either alliance. So, while the people of Judah themselves seemed to be in favor of the neighboring alliance, and King Ahaz preferred to rely on Assyria, Isaiah delivers them all a harsh warning. Because this people has rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloach, that's Judah's tiny freshwater spring, and rejoices over Rezin and the son of Remaliah, that's Pekach, therefore the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty flood waters of the Euphrates, the king of Assyria with all his pomp. It will overflow all its channels, run all over its banks, and sweep on into Judah, swirling over it, passing through it, and reaching up to the neck. Its outspread wings will cover the breadth of your land. Emmanuel. It's a pretty damning prophecy. Yet, notice how despite Judah being ravaged by the enemy, he still calls it Emmanuel, which, as you know, means God with us. He had promised that there would be a remnant of a tenth that would remain in the land, that even as the terebinth and the oak leave stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. So Isaiah offers a glimmer of hope, a tiny seed of hope. But it's a glimmer that would eventually turn into daybreak, a seed that would preserve the nation of Israel to this very day. Why am I giving all this detail, all the twists and turns of palace intrigue and geopolitical strategy? It's precisely because it is in the details of the events as they actually unfolded that we can hope to separate fiction from historical fact. The Bible is careful to recount all of this detailed historical narrative precisely so that we wouldn't fabricate our own fanciful legends, where we could imagine our own alternative facts, our own machinations, characters, and motives. It would have been easy to make all kinds of claims. But the truth can only be arrived at by looking at the facts, as limited as they may be, because it's the details of fact that ground us in truth. So it was in this context of intense political scheming and plotting, of absolute existential crisis, that Isaiah warns the people still not to read into the events more than there was there, to not see a conspiracy where there was none. There were enough real conspiracies that needed careful analysis and discernment, that obfuscating that insight with fantasy and conjecture would be to tear down the scaffolding of truth in its entirety. So there's that further sense of the word that we mean when we use the word conspiracy. Beyond the mere secretive, treacherous nature of a plot, oftentimes when we refer to a conspiracy theory, there's a sense that this is a plan that is so secretive, so elaborate, and so diabolical that it's virtually unknowable, except to a select few who have the power to intuit or magically discern what is really going on. That is, they don't have enough concrete evidence to prove their theory, but because the people involved are so untrustworthy or so evil, they just know that their theory must be true. Now, I want to be clear, this is not some evil impulse on the part of people who construct unlikely theories. We all do it on a daily basis because we try to make sense of the world we're living in, and with often very partial visibility on a situation, we project what might possibly be the rest of the picture that we cannot see. We speculate or guess based on the facts that we do know. Here's an example of how we all misread our world, and with intuition and speculation project our own alternative and largely false reality. Americans are repeatedly asked in polls whether they think there is more crime and murders now in the United States than there was 30 and 40 years ago. And they almost always respond by saying that crime must be getting worse. But in reality, the murder rate has fallen by more than half in that time period, and violent crime has fallen even more precipitously. Yet polls show that people felt safer then than they do now. By the way, the global crime rates have also continued to improve dramatically over the last decades, but most of us have the opposite impression. There are good reasons for that, of course. We are exposed to more negative news now than we used to be, and we generally aren't good at putting negative news in context, in perspective. Like most people, I believed my childhood years were more idyllic and far safer than my own children's childhood could be. But even though now I regularly look at the numbers, I still have to resist that false impression that this can't be true. Even though I roamed the streets freely as a young kid, generally without serious incident, I'm hesitant to let my own kids on those same streets, even though they're even safer today. We fear the sensational and tend to minimize risk when it's mundane. For example, we're more than twice as likely to die or suffer injury in a car accident than by violent crime. But we rarely think twice about getting into our cars, while there are many hours and areas of our city we avoid venturing out into for fear of crime. And of course, crime is real, and so are road accidents. But it's our skewed perception of the magnitude of that reality, our tendency not to see it in its proper proportions, that causes us to fear inordinately, to change our behavior and live our lives in fear of that exaggerated, essentially false information. One study showed that in the UK, in 1971, 80% of third graders walked to school alone. By 1990, that measure had dropped to 9%, and now it's even lower. This again, despite the fact that the streets have never been safer. We haven't purposely created a conspiracy theory, but our fears and misinformation have built one in our minds nonetheless. We live in a world that is nowhere near as dangerous as in 19th century Russia or the prophet Isaiah's Israel, with the crimes and conspiracy theories that fueled them. But we certainly do have challenges today, and in many ways they're more complicated because of how the globe is increasingly interconnected. Yet we are still just as susceptible to misinformation and creating conspiracy theories about how to meet those challenges. There are some more outlandish theories that people have subscribed to, such as the belief that there is a worldwide cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles preying on the innocent out there, or that the General Secretary of the United Nations is the Antichrist. But there are others, like our misperception of the rise in violence, that are rooted in legitimate fears of the unknown. This novel coronavirus has brought with it an avalanche of new data and competing ideas and versions of the truth. As various remedies, medicines, and new ways for public interaction were proposed, it has taken time for scientists to form a consensus on the basics of how to combat this disease. And even as scientists have reached a consensus on the nature of the disease, public officials may still argue over which policy measures to employ. For example, while a total lockdown is proven to stem the spread of the virus, there comes a point where the economic damage is deemed even more destructive, like having to choose between a Syria and Iran. Or chemotherapy can kill cancer, but too much will kill the body. But there are some issues that the global scientific community has reached a consensus on, such as the fact that vaccines are safe. One could reasonably be expected to be cautious in the beginning days, to examine all the evidence, to hear what the experts have concluded, and the scientific community has indeed concluded that the vaccines for treating coronaviruses are safe. Not just a single science lab of some unknown repute, but the entire community of urologists, scientists who study viruses, all over the world. If they are lying about their safety, then the thousands of scientists in every country in the world are collaborating in a vast conspiracy. A conspiracy of this scale is certainly impossible simply based on the fact that no group of humans so large and varied could ever hope to keep such a secret and alive. And if the scientists, all of them, are simply wrong about the efficacy and safety of the vaccine, then they can't be trusted on any medical intervention. And we should stop taking medicine altogether and stop going to the hospital at all. Any of it could be poisonous, and they would all have to be incompetent and untrustworthy. But we can't live in such fear. Not because fear is always bad, but because the information this fear is based on is inaccurate. Our ultimate freedom and redemption is in knowing the truth that is verifiable. The truth is verifiable with overwhelming evidence. If we stray into conspiracy theory, then we are in danger of losing our way to the truth, which, as we've seen, is a dangerous path indeed. Do not call conspiracy everything this people calls a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread.